In this lesson we're gonna work on the following thing. So whenever we start tracking the time for a particular activity and then refresh the page while timer is still running, after page refresh we see that the timer is actually stopped, but we need it to keep running if it was previously left in the running state. And since we have a bunch of such timers on one page, we need to add an additional property to timeline item object to keep track of the state of the timer. So let's switch over to timeline items module. In here we'll find the function which generates timeline item objects. This is this generate timeline items function. So in here we'll add an additional property. Let's call it, for example, isActive. So anytime we will start tracking the time, this property isActive will become true, and once we stop the timer, it will become false. But in order for this change to take effect, we have to actually go to load state function, which is inside of storage.js, and emulate the situation when there is no state in the local storage, because otherwise the previous app state will be loaded, where isActive property does not exist yet, and we will not see any changes. So temporarily in here, I'm gonna assign an empty state to the state constant so that the new timeline item objects will be generated that will contain new isActive property. And if we'll take a look at the array of timeline item objects inside Vue DevTools, in here we can see newly created property isActive, which is false by default. So now we can revert this temporary change inside of load state function, and we can proceed. So let's open up the component which renders timer. It is timeline stopwatch component. Anytime we click the button to start the timer, this function start gets executed. Let's open up the file where this function is defined. It is inside of this composable function stopwatch. And here we can see that when timer is started, is running reactive variable is assigned referenced to the timer. And when we stop the timer, this function stop is executed, and is running variable gets assigned value false. So based on this state variable, we can modify new property isActive. So we have to watch for changes in this is running reactive variable. Let's go back to timeline stopwatch component. And the way we're gonna do it is by using function watch. The first argument will be that reactive variable we'd like to watch for. It is a running variable in this case. And as a second argument, this watch function accepts closure, which will be triggered anytime the first argument will change. So in here what we need to do is actually update current timeline item object. We can do so by calling update timeline item function, but in this case we're gonna have to modify property isActive. So we will determine the value for this property based on the state variable of the timer called isRunning. So when this variable will be false, that means timer is stopped, otherwise it will contain a reference to the working timer. So we're gonna cast it to boolean before actually storing it inside isActive property. And just because a reference to the working timer will always be some non-zero value, this cast will always return true when the timer is running. So let's not forget an import watch function from the Vue package up here. And now to test it out, let's use console log statement inside of this closure and see what reactive variable isRunning will be equal to anytime we're gonna start or stop the timer. Let's switch over to the browser and try to start the timer. In this case we see that isRunning variable equals to true, and when we will stop the timer, this variable will be equal to false. That's exactly what we need. So let's go back to the editor, remove the temporary console log statement, and now based on the value of isActive property, we need to decide when to start the timer automatically. So I'm going to use hook onMounted to run some logic when the component is created. And here let's just check value of the property is active, and if this property will be true, in this case we need to start the timer. We can do so by calling function called start, like this. And since we are always saving the app state to the local storage before app gets closed, if we have previously left the timer running, this property is active will be true. And after page refresh, this timeline stopwatch component will be created, which means this unmounted hook will be called. And since this property is active will be true, we're gonna start the timer automatically. And now let's test this behavior. I'm gonna leave the timer running before refreshing the page. And this time, as we can see, after page refresh, timer is started automatically. So we have successfully loaded the last state of the timer from the local storage and decide whether we should automatically start the timer or not. Let's continue working on our project in the next lesson.